got you know, a bunch of great talks we saw in the morning, and a bunch of great talks left in the afternoon. And I'd like to introduce Chris Davis to talk about Espresso and Android testing. And I think it's going to be a really great talk. I'm sad that I'm not going to get to see myself, but let's give him a round of applause as he starts off.
I'm kind of curious, just who here is like active Android developers? Do most people here write tests, or they find the test difficult? Raise your hand if you manage to write tests, or raise your hand if you find the test too difficult to do. So I'm here to talk about Espresso, which is a UI specifically testing framework for Android. And my name's Chris Davis, and a lot of people come here and say they work for some company. I'm just a dude who does Android and do some Chrome OS development as well. I work for one of my biggest. I'm an independent developer. One of my biggest clients is a manufacturing company in Twin Cities. They're based in Twin Cities called Crystal Manufacturing. They're a big manufacturing company, so a lot of my original device development background is in manufacturing and business-to-business apps. I also do quite a bit of work for Augusto, which is one of the sponsors here. And they're a great company, and if anyone is in the actual GDD group, they usually meet there about every other time. So you've probably been to their building if you've gone to some of the meetings. I have my GitHub account there. There's not a ton there. There's a demo I have for this presentation up there at GitHub. I have another project I have up there that's barely complete. I have a couple open source projects. I have like 75% complete that I'm hoping to put up there within like the next few months. So that's where I would put them up. If I post anything about gaming or coding, I usually do it on Google+, and my LinkedIn profile is there. That's where I usually keep track of all my recent projects and stuff like that. This is my personal site. You won't find anything there on gaming. Only go there if you're a super nerd. It's all tabletop role-playing stuff. So you have to be a level 10 nerd to get in. Otherwise, so I'm also a recovering non-tester, to be honest with you. I've been developing professionally since I graduated college. Developing in an amateur fashion before that. But at least for 3/4 of my professional career, I really haven't done any testing. It wasn't popular when I started developing. I never worked for companies that made it a priority. And so it wasn't until maybe about 6 years ago I started, when I started having other developers work for me to do some server code that I made them test. So when I got into testing, I made other people do it for me. But eventually the company I worked for, Crystal, they were doing a lot of device deployments in manufacturing. So at that point, when I was throwing apps into the app stores, or whether it was in our Google Domains app, or whether it was in the public app store, at that point I really had to kind of quit being a non-tester, because I was putting this code out into the app store. If something gets broken, it's going to take me hours to get it deployed. I mean, web development is really seductive to not testing because you can fix it right away, but you can't do this with devices. So once I started doing Android development, I said, okay, fine, I'm going to get into this testing, I'm going to write all these tests. Another thing is, I came into Android, I had done Java, in like a prior development lifetime, but it had been like 6 or 7 years since I had touched Java when I sat down to do Android. So I hadn't really spent a lot of time with JUnit or anything like that. So I was kind of coming at it from a kind of a newbie point of view for testing. And so I started with what Google had on their website. I was using Android test case to like do my kind of back-end testing, stuff that only needed an activity, nothing that UI related. And I use Instrumentation API to write my UI tests. It was hard, but I did it. I got my tests to get covered. I started writing better apps. They were less buggy. I was happy. It was a lot of work, but I was happy. And then Espresso came along and kind of changed the way I kind of view about it. So before I kind of get started on Espresso, just a little bit of background on it. It's a UI testing library that Google developed internally first. I'm not sure why they felt they needed to do it. Probably just because the instrumentation library API was so frustrating to use. But they usually have a testing conference called like GTC, I think. every year. And in 2013, they kind of announced Espresso and made it open source, and this was Espresso 1.1. I kind of saw that, I got started with it. It made my testing a lot easier to do. And so for much of 2014, I wrote tests using Espresso. There's a little dark period there between at the end of 2014 where Lollipop was kind of coming out, so the L edition was released, and Espresso didn't support it. So it's okay, it was just the preview edition. Espresso doesn't work, but then Lollipop was released, and then new phones were released, and Espresso still was not updated. I kind of was feared this is going to be one of those Google projects where they kind of announce it and then they abandon it after a while, or maybe it would be like Volley where they talk a lot about it for a while and then suddenly you don't hear much about it, there's no documentation on it or anything like that. So luckily though, in December, they released Espresso 2.0, which fixed a lot of minor problems that was in Espresso. They added it to the support library and the open source project. They moved all the documentation over to developer.google.android.com. So now it's kind of the de facto Google-approved UI testing framework. Some similar libraries that kind of address the same area, but they're a little different. And I don't really have a lot of experience with any of these because I kind of just decided to stick with the instrumentation API until Espresso came along. But Robotium, Selendroid, Appium, I think, and Calabash, I think that's pronounced right, I'm not sure. Has anyone used any of these? Calabash works for iOS too, doesn't it? It's kind of, so you have any good success? Yes, good sex. Do you have any good success with any of these? Or what do you think about them? Or,
it's a step up from the instrumentation API. Use the instrumentation. It's not fun.
One nice thing about Espresso is it's a little more tied in with your development environment and has a little bit better Android Studio support. So if anyone does these and want to chime in while I'm doing it, kind of, hey, this is how you do this in Appium or Calabash, I'd be interested in hearing that. So why Espresso anyways? And the main reason is so you don't have to do stuff like this. First thing you see, I have waited for it, I think. In the instrumentation library, you have to do stuff like add monitors to monitor activity state. You often have to run things on the main UI thread because you want to like do some clicks or you want to do something else that you've done on the UI thread. And often you need to go on and off from the UI thread, so you end up putting this code around tons of different blocks, and you're cut and pasting this all day long. If you're doing that, you're going to have to wait for the main thread to be idle before you can really test anything, because who knows if the UI is done doing what it needs to do. Worse, you might do this. That's sleep. Maybe you're like have some sort of background resource that's doing something, and you need to provide an amount of time that you for sure these things will get done. You're downloading a file, or making a REST call, or writing to a local data system in a separate thread. And you just can't just give it like 2 seconds, because what if it runs really slow? You want your test to work, so you've got to give it usually a good enough time to get done with your test. And that just makes your test run super slow, because you're doing that and you compound compound it with like a bunch of other tests. You're doing a lot of sleeps, and your tests take forever. So Espresso extracts the instrumentation API. It's got a much smaller, more fluent, simpler API. You're going to write more reliable tests. The tests are going to run considerably more faster. It's going to help with the synchronization of, it will do all the synchronization of UI events, as well as some other type of asynchronous tasks. But it also gives you a mechanism to synchronize other resources you might be using in the background. And it's very extendable. Every aspect of it you can create a custom version of it, although Google's done a pretty good job of pretty much providing everything you need as far as Android is concerned. So, before we start writing tests or start showing you tests, you kind of got to get set up. And luckily with 2.0, this is way easier than it was before. First part is to work with your Gradle. And I'm going to start down here first. You need to add the annotation library to both your app and your test You're going to want to add the support library for testing, and as well as the Espresso core. And there isn't a contribute library, and it's optional, but as you see after I get done doing these slides, it's not really that optional, so probably want to add it. In addition to Espresso, they released a new test runner, which I'm not really going to cover a lot on here, but you need to tell Android Studio to use that new test runner. And this is not part of the official documentation, that's packing option to exclude this license file, but I run into this problem all the time. It could be just because I'm including similar dependencies to what is in Espresso. So if you run into an error basically saying that it has duplicate files, or duplicate libraries, or duplicate license files, add this, it'll fix that problem. I have added this here, although I think lately when I've been writing tests, Android Studio has been doing this for me. But you got to make sure that when you have your run configuration to run your tests, that you're setting the new test runner. But I don't think you really need to do this anymore. It also tells you that you should turn off certain animations to get your test to run without any flakiness. Do this if you want. I've not shut this off, and I really haven't run into a ton of problems. So if you don't really feel like every time you can sit down and test and turning off all your animations, or if you don't have a dedicated phone, or you're not using an emulator, I wouldn't fret too much about turning off the animations. But if you start getting weird tests, then try that first. So here's what an example test looks like. It's no different than a normal instrumentation test. But the key difference here is this is my Espresso test. And if I was writing this with the normal instrumentation I, this would be, probably 20 lines of code. It could be, depending on what I was doing. But this is basically just saying to grab a view and click it and see if it's, and grab a view and see if it's displayed. So it's a very, very basic test. That's kind of how all your tests are going to look like. And then Android Studio sets this up now by default, but your tests go in the Android test folder, and that's parallel to your app code. So here's the API kind of broken down. There's an Espresso entry point, and when Google first announced Espresso, they kind of made a big deal that they only have 2 API calls, and that's OnView and OnData. They've expanded since then, but OnView basically is what you're going to use to get a view, and so there's a few more entry points, but for the most part you're going to use OnView and another one I'll show you later called OnData, and these ones will take a view matcher to return back a single view to work on. In this example here, I'm looking at based on ID and ID of DevFest. So the other thing you do is that once you got a view, and you can chain all these, is perform an action. This is your basic click action, and then you can assert state. So this is a view assertion here, and then this is another matcher, just like the one up there, but this matcher can return back more than one view because it might see whether or not this is included in a group of views. So that's like the 4 main components that Espresso is going to give you. It's going to have your entry point, it's going to give you some matchers, it's going to give you some actions, and it's going to give you some assertions. Or it's going to just give you this one assertion and then use another matcher with it. So view matchers, they're based on Hamcrest matchers. I'm told that if you're familiar with JUnit 3, that you'd be familiar with these. But if anyone else, has anyone else ever used a product called, or a library called Mockito? I guess well, those are prevalent in there as well. I'll talk a little bit about that later. But it's almost a topic in itself to go on. Most of the matches you're going to have are provided by Espresso. Will get the job done, so you can just use them without knowing too much about how Hamcrest works. But it's worth going and checking out Hamcrest. It almost deserves its own discussion. You're going to use the matchers to find a single view for OnView, or you're going to find one or more views for your assertions. And in Espresso, the ViewMatchers class implements all the Android specific matchers. There's other matchers you can use as well that just come from Handcrest, which I'll show. But for all the ones that actually manipulate and ask look for views, those are all provided by the Espresso library. So, finding your view. Most of the time, you're going to just need an ID to find the view you want. And then you can just get started with your test or your actions. But as Android developers know, sometimes you either might not have an ID on that element, or there's going to be multiple IDs of that element. Maybe it's in a list view or something like that, or some other group view. In those cases, you can use with text or with hint as well to narrow down. But again, just like with an ID, that text could be present on the page multiple locations. That hint could be on there multiple locations, less likely. So if you want to be clever about it, you can use content description. And this kind of has an added benefit of making your app more accessible to blind people or however else Android uses the content description for accessibility. And with that, you want to give your content description a unique name. Unfortunately, this one takes a hard string, so instead of an ID. But it allows you to kind of find any view in your view without having to worry about a duplicate on there, as long as you're making sure your content descriptions are unique, and people that are blind will appreciate it. Or you can kind of get tricky with it and use all of, which basically will take two view matchers and then find kind of the intersection between the two. All of and not is just their normal Handcrest matchers. They're not specifically part of Espresso. But in this case here, it's finding all the views with this ID, and it's finding one that has the string DevFest as well. And hopefully that gets you down to one view. If you don't, you're gonna, the test is gonna fail. Or the opposite here, saying, hey, give me all the ones with an ID, but not with a certain text. That's kind of the most important part. That seems pretty self-explanatory, doesn't it? Does anyone have any questions on that? All right, view actions. So once you have a view, OnView I think returns back a view interaction, and that has two methods that can be used: perform and check. Perform provides a view action. It takes one or more view actions, and it really is nice to think about this as kind of a natural action. I like to think of Espresso as a person. It replaces a person. Normally you would go through and start doing typing buttons or hitting buttons, typing in text. Espresso is going to perform the role of the person. So all the actions it takes should be natural on the screen, whether it's swiping or clicking or what other actual actions. All the view actions will take place on the UI thread. And then the view actions class in Espresso is what implements most of the common actions. And again, I should have said this for view matchers as well, but view matchers, you can make your own custom view matcher. I don't really provide an example of that because, frankly, I haven't really had a need to make a lot of custom matchers because Google's provided most of what I need. Same with the actions. Most of the actions Google's have provided will handle what you need to do. I can only think of one good case, maybe if you want to maybe composite actions together. You have a very specific control you've made, so you need to create a special action to manipulate a custom control.
What about like drag and drop? Are those actions already supported, or are they?
There's like long press and it's a good question. I'd have to look at the API. I mean, maybe that's a good candidate for a custom view action. I think you'd have to kind of combine some of the standard actions to do that, like a long press. Like if you were doing a drag on a long press or drag on a short press, it has those. Okay. And then it has scroll as well. But it's a great question, though. I guess I don't do a lot of dragging as much, but yeah. And again, you can make a custom view action. The only time I've ever thought about doing that is to maybe make an action I do all the time and start combining them together into one view action. But it's really just as easy for me just to chain the actions I need to do anyway. So here's some examples of performing these actions. The top one there is just a normal click. You've already seen that. And you can chain them, which is useful if you want to do assertions in between your clicks. So you can do an action, do an assertion, do an action, do an assertion, which makes it really easy to read, I think. And then you can also just provide them though in the method itself. You can't do insertions in the middle of those, but if you know you're going to do 3 things in a row without an insertion, you can just put it in all one method call. I kind of put this one here to use this when you can if you're using keyboard entry, because if you try to click on a view that is behind the keyboard, it's just going to click the keyboard. Because it's kind of like it kind of figures out where you want to click. It doesn't like simulate a click, it actually does a click on the screen. So if you're trying to click a view that's behind the keyboard, you're just going to hit a number. So for a while, I was getting test failed every now and then because the keyboard wasn't closing. You can also close the keyboard by putting a new line character in, new text insertion. And that's what I did originally before. They didn't have the soft keyboard originally, right? Or at least it was finicky. I can't remember if it came in 2 or not, but for a while I was just putting new line characters in to make sure the keyboard went away. But close soft keyboard.
Is there a difference between those two there other than semantic? I mean,
no.
Just
The only difference is here in this one, I could stick a check in between the chaining. This one, I can't. These all have to be actions. And I think this is the preferred way to do it. Maybe it runs a little faster if you're doing it that way. I've never tested that. And this one here I kind of put to show, if you have something in a scroll view, you can do scroll to it before you click on it. Obviously, if you try to click on it without scrolling to it, you're going to fail your test. And scroll to has no effect if it's already visible. So if you're doing testing on different display sizes and stuff like that, on your tablet it might show, but on a small screen it's not going to show. Surround your thing with scroll to. It will work if it's on screen. It will work if it's off screen.
On that, when you do the close keyboard, does it like if you have any IME actions, does that prefer that, or just dismissing the keyboard?
It has. There's methods for taking
IME
actions. Lost my key. Let's do a little fetch one. View assertions. There's really only this one. There's only this one assertion is check, which tries to match another matcher to the conditions that you've set forth. So you get a view and you say, I keep on showing is displayed. So is displayed is going to return back every single view that is displayed on the screen, and so we'll see if not yours is within that list of it. So that's kind of the signature for it. It takes a matcher, like I said. The ViewMatchers class, again, has ones you use with assertion. So in this example here, I do OnView check to see if the text matches what I have in this string resource. Most of these methods, just for reference, can just take normal strings. It just is useful to use the string resources.
Do you provide a string that if it fails, print the log?
There's nothing in there like kind of like you mean like you do like a assertion. You can provide a string that describes what happened. Not that I know of. It was just usually just going to give you back basically saying this doesn't match the view hierarchy or something like that.
False.
Yeah. It will tell you. It will when these things fail. It will like spit out the whole view hierarchy for you and say like if you try to like first if you try to like on view and you try to pull in more than one view and you say hey I give it an ID but you have the ID on there more than once, it will show you the view hierarchy and say hey I have two views of it. Or if it fails the test will say hey it failed, didn't find it, here's the view hierarchy. So I'm talking about views, but what about adapter views? They present a little bit different problem than a traditional view because only a subset of the adapter view's children are going to be displayed on the screen at any given time. So you don't know whether the item you're looking for is going to be displayed or not. Could depend on the screen size, could just depend on how long the list is. You can still use OnView if you know your view is going to be displayed. So if you're like just going to pick the top one in the list of your view to make your test, you can just still use OnView and make sure you narrow down your search to make sure you hit it. You know, there's probably going to be the same idea on there, so you'll probably have to use some sort of combination or some sort of content description to get it. But you can still use OnView. If not, you have to use OnData, which will load the adapter item into view before it tries to start doing operations on it. If I had to pick one point to kind of I feel like is a little more like finicky or a little bit harder to use or doesn't work always as good as I want to, it's the OnData call. Works fairly good, but this is a very simple example where I'm just using kind of a string adapter. And this is kind of in the screen I had before. This is basically a spinner, so it's just using a simple array adapter of strings. So those are easy to find. I'm just going to say, hey, give me all the instances of string class, and this is going to look at your adapters to figure out what adapter it's going to. That's kind of a little bit of magic there because we have more than one adapter. We'll kind of look at other adapters in your activity. Finds one that's string, looks for one that says GDG, and then it will perform the click on it. So you're going to employ this a lot for pickers and all your smaller adapter views. It's a little harder to work with when you're working with like list views because often you're going to have a custom adapter. So this has to be comparing on whatever custom classes you are working on or however else you want to do it. RecyclerView is not an adapter view. So everything I'm talking about here has nothing to do, it doesn't work with RecyclerView. Which you might think is a bad thing at first because, hey, we have this method to look for it. The RecyclerView is like an adapter view. It serves kind of the same goal, but you can't use all this. That's actually a good thing because, again, I don't really like OnData as much. So the RecyclerView has its own API. It's better. So and we're all going to start using RecyclerViews now, so we don't have to worry about that anymore. So now, kind of go full circle. Here's a full example of a test from my this is kind of the example app I have up in GitHub. It's just very ugly, obviously. But here, this one is very simple. Just test to see if that header image is there, which is not a test you normally write, but for this demo, this one's a little more realistic. Here, I'm clicking the spinner, so that actually will make the list view appear on the screen. Then I'm calling OnData, which one is equal to Android. So this will find give me all the adapter items, and then just the one that has Android. In this case here, it would still probably work if I used OnView because all the items are on screen, but that list could be big, or maybe it's you've used the drop-down box model or something like that, or the screen could be tilted in landscape mode. So then here I'm just checking, once in this app here, when you select the item, the track you want to go to, it just changes the text on here, so then I'm just asserting that this text actually did change. So all these things are asynchronous, since the adapter is going to load asynchronously, and then the view is going to have to send a message to update this. So you see here, I don't have to worry anything about the UI synchronization. I'll just write the test, and it will wait, and we'll verify whether it worked or not. So, kind of the big elephant in the room is synchronization. And this is one of the best things that Espresso gives to you, but it doesn't give you a total solution for it. Because the main issue there for this, when you're using the instrumentation API, is that the instrumentation runs on its own thread from the main UI thread, so you're constantly trying to sync the two when you're using the instrumentation API. And so you add into any background resources you might be using, and then you've got 2 or more threads you have to make sure that are in the right state before you can run your test, or you can assert something. So Espresso will wait for all UI operations, which I kind of already explained. It also waits for the default async thread pool. Now you're not really supposed to use async task, but if you are, Espresso tests will work out of the box for you. If you need to have a background resource you want to sync, and probably the big example is going to be an intent service, or any number of background resources. Or if you're using an API that doesn't use a standard async task, which most of them don't. I use a networking library a lot called Ion. And when I first started using Espresso, all my tests were failing. Even ones I didn't throw off into an intent service, ones I was just using it, they were still failing. And so I created an idling resource for the Ion library, so that always, whenever any network communications are happening with Ion, my idling resource will tell Espresso, hey, I'm still working on something, don't do any assertions yet, or don't do any performs. In your test, you got to register an idle resource. This is the one I made up here. For example, data idle resource. And that will tell Espresso to use it. In the contrib library, there's a counting idle resource. If you simply just want to have a resource that kind of like every time you use it, it goes up, and then when you're done using it, it goes down, you can use this one. The way it's kind of developed, you kind of got to mock out your objects to use it properly. So if you're not mocking out your objects for testing, then this was a little bit harder to use. So I haven't done a ton of mocking in a lot of my tests in the past, so I never really used the counting idle resource very much. So I ended up just rolling my own. It wasn't very hard. So here's an example of an idle resource, and they're not very hard. So you implement the idling resource interface. You're always going to want to store the resource callback, which this will be called by Espresso. Will give you a resource callback. And then simply the get name function just provides for logging in. I can never pronounce that word. You want to pronounce the intimacy? Or, yeah. Anyone familiar with REST will kind of understand that. Just making sure that what you put in, you get out. You don't really have to worry about that. Then it calls this function is idling now, which you either got to return back true if it is idle, meaning you're done, or false if you're not idling. And even though you've passed true or false, you still have to, when you want to transition to idle, you got to call the callback. Not sure why it's asking you to return back a true or false there if you have to call this method anyways as well, but nonetheless, it uses it somewhere. So this is all you need to do to implement something that will make your test wait for something to get done before it runs an assertion, and it's not very much code you need to write. So RecyclerView. We're all using RecyclerView now, and there's a few other cases. This wasn't in the library before. It wasn't until December, so whenever I was dealing with RecyclerView, I just pretty much had to like scroll around with my API calls and get what I wanted to. And the RecyclerView API is actually, I think, nicer than OnData because it allows you just to scroll certain positions instead of like, there was nothing on OnData that said, hey, specifically to scroll to this position. At least it's not with like one call. So like I said, it's not adaptive because you can't use OnData. You can use OnView to match your RecyclerView to match the actual RecyclerView, and I have an example. Hopefully I have time to kind of go over my demo and I can show you how this is done. And then you use the RecyclerView Actions API from Espresso to contribute. It's part of the contributor library, so obviously if you want to test RecyclerView, you're going to have to include the contributor library. That's why I say you're pretty much going to have to contribute it by default. So for example, here I'm getting the RecyclerView, and then I'm performing an action. Notice how this is where I'm doing the action. So RecyclerView action item position. This basically will perform an action. So the click at item position 0, which is easier than I would do on data. And then, or here, this is scroll to position 0, which I don't know why I would do that, but you might scroll to the end or something like that, which is common to do. But that's an easier way than using on data. So that's an improvement since the release 2.0. Perhaps your app has a draw layout or drawer layout. And so Espresso contrib again gives you matchers and drawer actions for the drawer layouts. And these are actually new entry points. So Espresso used to say that you only had 2 entry points. Well, the open drawer and close drawer are actually entry points that will open and close a drawer. And then there's a matcher there, whether it's open and closed, and that's pretty much all you need for your drawers. And once they're viewable, then you can just use them on view like you would normally to like detect and manipulate the views that are in the drawer. The action bar. You can use OnView on menu items in the action bar just like you would normal view if they're invisible in the action bar. If they're not visible in the action bar, you got to use another entry point, open action bar overflow options menu, and you actually have to use the instrumentation API to get the target context. But that will open the overflow menu, so then the menu options will appear. Once you got the overflow menu, then you can just click on using OnView again to click on the overview menu options. And it works with the new toolbar as well. So, let me see the slide. Oh, well, there's date pickers, time pickers, and I'll show it in the app. I don't know how my slide got missed in here, but date pickers. There's a contributor library to like set a date and set a time for a time picker or a date picker, so that you don't have to try to like find the views inside those composite controls and set them. Just one API called set the time, set the date, and then you can just start asserting. So before I kind of show you the app, some practical examples, my kind of tips here is the way Espresso works is since it's automating so many things, you can really use it to save your time. And I'm not one for like test-driven development in the sense that you have to write a test before you. Some people are into that, and that's cool. But I don't necessarily sit down and write tests before I write code. If you're totally into test-driven development, you would do that first. But I do find that I maximize my time savings if I make sure I write the test before I've really done anything significant in these views, because say if you're doing a registration, a login, you're going to go through that process a zillion times, testing it. Just write your test right away to like fill in the fields, hit the buttons, and then you're just going to save yourself an enormous amount of time. And so eventually, as time goes on, maybe you'll save yourself some development time by writing the test, which is not usually the case for writing tests. Usually it's more time. Sure, you're ending up with better code, but it's taking more time to do it. And I'm sure most of you guys, like me, you're under time constraints to get stuff done. It's also useful, when I'll talk about later, if you're trying to deploy your test to multiple devices. The quicker you write your test, the more you can test to multiple devices. The other thing is, you can write tests for every activity, even if it's not the main entry point activity in your app. It also makes testing quicker, so you have your main activity, and then you have like all these sub-activities that are spawned. You can just write the test for that sub-activity, and then it will just launch that activity right away, run the test out, and close it down. It makes your test run way faster. I mean, they're running really fast just because you're not sleeping ever, but not having to be able to not having to code a login or something like that on your test every time is useful. Also, kind of makes you make sure you contain your activities so they don't really rely as much on other activities. So, for example, here I have a RecyclerView activity in my example. And that test will just launch the RecyclerView activity and run the test on it. And this kind of goes. This is nothing to do with Espresso, but just in case you don't know, I mean, Android test case is there. If you've done any testing, you know it's there. But don't use Espresso for stuff like networking, data storage, stuff like that. You're just giving yourself more overhead than you need to. If you just need an activity and resources and nothing else in the app, whether you're doing networking calls or saving data to a database or something like that, or SQLite database or something like that, do that all in Android test case. Oh, I put it in the wrong. There's the pickers. I put the slide in the wrong position. So there's the example of the date and time pickers. So I'm getting the picker view, and then I'm performing a picker action. So if you're into testing and you really want to go further down this rabbit hole, here's some things you can check out. Spoon is a library or tool that will take your test and deploy it at every single device that you have connected to your computer and run it simultaneously. It'll give back it will take screenshots. It will give you back kind of like a report of what happened. I haven't really used it a ton, but I'm looking to use it. It's kind of something I'm researching right now. But it would be really nice for me. I mean, I often have like 3 or 4 devices set up. I like testing on devices a lot. So I'd like to be able to just run my thing once and have it run on every single device I have. Mojito, which I mentioned already before, is a mocking framework a lot of Espresso developers kind of recommend. Again, it's something I'm not an expert on that. I'm kind of something I'm looking into right now. Dagger is nothing specifically for testing, but I know Espresso uses it under the hood. At least it uses something that it uses it under the hood, because during Espresso 1.1 I had to exclude that from my Gradle, otherwise it would cause build errors. So, but it really allows you, with dependency injection, it allows you to mock a lot easier. So looking into Dagger and learning about how that works, and if you can employ it in your app, it's going to be more testable. And then the new Android test runner, if you want to learn about that. So, does anyone have any questions? I barely have enough time to show you.
Have you used this with any of the Google Maps view or the annotations?
You can use them. It might be hard to find the IDs inside the map view and stuff like that, but as far as like clicking on stuff like that, you can do it with those. I'm sure you can do some investigation to figure out what the IDs are using in various components. Once you figure out those IDs, then you can do it.
So do you have this set up to run on like a Jenkins server with a bunch of devices hooked up?
You can.
All of them? You don't have that though?
No, I don't. I don't currently do any continuous integration with my Android work right now.
Okay. And then, do you know a way to take screenshots as the tests are running, or is that something I should use to explore?
I think you can use, I think they just released something called like UI Automator or something like that. Google did recently. Am I familiar with that? Is that the right name? It's called UI Automator, I think, and you can use that, I think, in conjunction with Espresso to take screenshots. And I think that's how Student does it.
Okay.
Any other questions? I mean, this app is up here, so anyone can look at it at any time. I'm not out of time anyway. Go ahead.
So you didn't talk about, do you do any tests that do things like workflow, procrastination, just being like, make sure I click this, I make sure the next activity I match is this one and not a different one?
Yes, you can do that. And
That's always been a big problem in instrumentation tests, is trying to wait for the next one, and then when is the next activity actually rendered?
Right, that's the nice thing that Espresso does. It will wait until that activity is fully run. And I can, and this test here, which I will, so, it's way too small, isn't it? Can I make that bigger? Isn't there a presentation mode or something like that in this? I don't know if you can see this at all, but just this one here, this RecyclerView test I have.
Presentation goes underneath the view menu at the top. Bottom one. Very bottom there.
Okay, so in this example, in this line 51 there, this one actually clicks the action bar on the app, which just have words of RecyclerView as one of my menu options. And then it's opening up the recycler activity. And here I'm testing that the RecyclerView is actually on the screen. So this is a kind of a way to say, hey, the new activity is loaded because the RecyclerView wouldn't be on there if it wasn't on the activity. So you can like go in and out of activities if you want to kind of go through the whole app. And I do that a lot. Usually when I'll kind of think about how a customer or my main user is going to use the app, and I'll write one test that literally just does everything. So that I can do that kind of that end-to-end test. But I often do like to just kind of write tests for the specific activity too, so I can just quickly test all the features of that. But here's like, so that's an example. So there's a RecyclerView test where it opens up the menu item and then checks the RecyclerView. But then, I don't know how to get out of the presentation mode.
Oh, you go to the top again.
Actually, maybe I'll just find the file here. Okay. So there, now here's just a test mode just for the RecyclerView activity. And I'm running the exact same test here, but I'm just not opening up the other activity. Here's the rest of my rest of these tests in this demo. The one I kind of want to show you, just the other ones I pretty much had in my presentation, but this is this background test one. So this is actually testing a background resource, and I created an idling resource for it. So here I'm creating a service idling resource I wrote, and this code is actually pretty useful. It will work with pretty much any intent service to like kind of detect whether it's running in the system. I register that service, and then here I'm opening up the overflow action bar. I'm clicking a menu item that's on the screen called background. It runs this background test. My intent just literally sleeps for I think like 5 seconds. The whole service intent just sleeps, and then it saves a piece of data to shared preferences. And then I have a shares preference detector in the main part of the app that is detecting the change, and it's just throwing it up on the screen. So after the background is done, I'm asserting that DevFest 2015, which is what I wrote in the service intent, is on the screen at this point. So I will just kind of quickly show you as my last thing. The idling resource I created for this. So here's like, I forgot to change one of my names. So I copied this from a different project. This idle resource here is the only thing that really matters here is this is idle now. So here I'm like checking to see whether or not this service is running. If it is running, I return back false. If it's not running, I return back true, and then I recall back, or I'm sorry, is idle now. I actually got this wrong. Kind of shows you the return value doesn't matter as much. This is what really matters. So my tests all work, and I'm returning back the wrong value. That's an example of an idling resource, and they're not really hard to write. Like, I'm going to kind of make this one so it'll work for any service intent and throw it up in GitHub. So you just really just have to pass in your package name and your class name, and that should work for any service or any intent service. That's about all I have. Unless you guys have any more questions, I'll stay here. Go ahead.
I didn't catch this earlier, but is this code up on your GitHub?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
I'll probably continue upping this. I plan to do some more of the presentation on Espresso, so I'm trying to make like an app that kind of shows all the different test types. So I have a bulk of the test types you might do in there.
I look forward to seeing that.
Any other questions? Thanks for coming to my speech.